Our topic this evening is smashing the Ten Commandments. So we are going to do a deep dive into the Ten Commandments and look at it from a bunch of different directions that maybe you might be expecting. There is a classic second season Simpsons episode called Homer versus Lisa and the Eighth Commandment, which has just a wonderful little episode that begins right at the beginning at Mt Sinai in 1220 BC, it says, where the Israelites are wandering around in the desert and they are currently living in a state of lawless chaos. They're running around fighting and screaming and lighting things on fire. Different characters are talking at the beginning, and these are Zohar, the adulterer, Ezron, the carver of graven images, and Homer the thief. All three of these guys are gainfully employed in this era before any commandments have been given, before there's any law, and so they're living in this pre-commandment era, a lawless society. As they're talking, they figure, well, they'd probably have another 2 weeks of wandering in the desert before they get to the promised land. They're a little off in their speculation. Everything changes when Moses comes down from the mountain, bringing 2 tablets of the law on which are inscribed 10 commandments by which to live life. He then says he will read them in no particular order. Thou shalt not make any graven images. And so Ezron, the carver of graven images, says, ah, my God. Moses then says, thou shalt not commit adultery, which leads Zohar, the adulterer, to say, looks like the party's over. Homer's enjoying these. Keep them coming, Moses, keep them coming. And then Moses says, thou shalt not steal. So Homer the thief is out of a job. So I think this snippet does a really good job of reimagining the consequences of this story from Exodus if the story were historical. So prior to receiving divine prohibition, technically all of the activities forbidden by the law would have been licit. And so there aren't any laws anyway in this society against stealing or murder. They're given these laws. Thus, the pre-commandment society is portrayed as, absurdly lawless and chaotic here in the Simpsons story. So, again, as we read the story as history, we have a story in the book of Exodus that explains the origin of the law, and then we also have a copy of that law. So we are given to understand that the artifact of the tablets, or maybe rubble from the tablets, we don't know exactly how much of the tablets had survived, but they still existed in the First Temple period, where they were kept in the Ark of the Covenant. And one of the reasons why it's called the Ark of the Covenant is the tablets of the law, the covenant, were placed inside them. And so if we had those two things, if the story had historicity, in other words, if this actually happened, then we can imagine or extrapolate that there was a time, without law. It's not a time that's the authors of Exodus were worried about. They weren't historians. They are not trying to create the logical possibilities. But if we were to assume that the story is history, this is a consequence that we could assume. So the actual origins were that ancient Israelites had inherited a law and they wondered about its origins. So either tablets or the rubble that is in the Ark of the Covenant and the text that is existing around the time of Hezekiah and Josiah, this text of the law. And so having that, they then created a story to explain its origin. This is what we call an etiological myth. Where did this come from? Well, here's a story how we create it. And since the law existed before the story, and the story is, in fact, not history, it's a myth, there's no era that existed when it was okay to murder and steal. That's actually, it's not actual history. And so that's why it's a consequence of our false historicization of an origin identity story and a mythic ideological myth. So with that kind of a preface, in order to get to our deep dive into the Ten Commandments, I want to look at Moses and the book of Exodus along with the rest of the 5 books attributed to Moses. So who was Moses? All of the information that we have about this character is actually from biblical texts, or it's dependent on biblical texts. And by dependent on biblical texts, I mean we'll have later writings, for example, by Josephus or by other historians, but they are using as their source the Bible. So they don't have any additional text that they are working on that predates the biblical text. So the biblical text is the oldest stuff that we have, and we don't have any contemporary information, contemporary even to the Bible, from outside of the Bible. So, nevertheless, Moses was a known figure in some of our earliest or earlier biblical sources. So unlike some of the characters and stories in Genesis, so for example, Adam and Eve and the Eden story, which are really not mentioned by any of our earliest biblical writers, which is to say prophets whose writings extend into, or who at least were historical figures in the First Temple period, and some components of their text, while they may have been added to and edited over the course of the later time periods, there's some of those texts presumably date back to that earliest period. In those, the Exodus story was known pretty early on, and we also have mentions of Moses. So the earliest mention may be in the book of Hosea, and Hosea was a historical prophet who was active in the 8th century before the Common Era in the northern kingdom, before the northern kingdom fell to Assyria, so before the lost 10 tribes are taken away. We read in Hosea 12:13, "By a prophet the Lord brought Israel up from Egypt, and by a prophet he was guarded." So, we don't have Moses. This is the Exodus story. Israel is brought up from Egypt by a prophet. Moses isn't mentioned by name here. And, we have to just do a lot of research into, anything that might be an addition. So Hosea is heavily edited after the fall of the First Temple, so either during the exile or during the Second Temple period or both, but this might be one of our earliest mentions of the Exodus. Moses is also referenced by name in Isaiah, but unfortunately it's only the later chapters of Isaiah that were added after the destruction of the First Temple. So as you probably know, the book of Isaiah, there's an actual historic prophet, and then there are later continuers in following centuries, sometimes called Deutero-Isaiah and Tertio-Isaiah, a school of Isaiah, people writing as Isaiah, but writing in the Second Temple period. So Moses and stories from the Exodus are mentioned in various Psalms, and the Psalms are a compilation, some of which are early and some of which are late and some of which are edited. So the dates of these are arguable, but Moses is definitely referenced by Jeremiah, and the story is very familiar to Jeremiah, and he's a prophet at least who's active in Judah after the fall of the northern kingdom, and then he is still active after the fall of Judah, after the destruction of the temple there, so at the end of the First Temple period. So Jeremiah is there right at the end, and his school and tradition associate him with maybe some of the, with the book of Deuteronomy, and maybe also some of the early texts that become the Bible, that become the Deuteronomic history, that become the Torah. So in Jeremiah 15:1, he says, "The Lord said to me, though Moses and Samuel stood by me, yet my heart would not turn toward this people." So the people are being condemned, and it doesn't matter if, these great prophets of old, as far as Jeremiah is concerned, Moses and Samuel would have been standing there too. So he is obviously idolizing those prophets and knows Moses as a great previous prophet. According to the book of Exodus, the Israelites are enslaved in Egypt, and because Pharaoh fears that their numbers are too great, he orders all of the Hebrew midwives to kill the newborn boys by tossing them into the Nile. Moses' mother puts a tricky spin on this and puts the baby Moses into a basket, which then floats on the river until he is discovered and then ultimately adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. And Pharaoh's daughter, we read in Exodus 2:10, named him Moses because, she said, I drew him out of the water. So this is a normal convention in the Torah, and it's specifically a sign of the Yahwist author, the J author, and we'll talk about the different source texts of the Pentateuch, the books of Moses. But essentially, the J author loves to use puns in order to create folk etymologies in order to explain names. And so this phrase, I drew him out of the water, takes the Hebrew meshithihu to create the false folk etymology for Moses. But nevertheless, that is almost certainly, it's certainly not what the real etymology of Moses is. That's just a pun. In other words, Moses sounds like Meshithihu, right? So Moshe. And so that's a folk etymology like people continue to make even to this day. Like the word her story is a folk etymology that thinks that his story, because it sounds like his, it means his story, when in fact it's coming from a word that's totally unrelated to that, then to the pronoun his. So Moses, or the Egyptian word Mosa, which means son of, is a very common suffix in Egyptian names. And so here Moses is being raised, according to the Exodus story, in Egypt, and is part of this taking the Israelites out of Egypt story. So if there is a real Egyptian connection, the fact that Moses is a common Egyptian name particle is interesting. If it's a coincidence, it's quite a coincidence. It could be, though. So, for example, theophoric names where we're including a god name, a name of a god. So, for example, Thutmose, which is the name of a pharaoh. Thutmose means son of Thoth, one of the main Egyptian gods. And then a famous pharaoh like Ramesses, it means, in part, it means son of Ra, so the sun god. So Moses, like Thutmose or Ramoses, like that, Mosa might just be a Egyptian theophoric name where the god name here is missing, or it's been abbreviated. So Moses would have had a longer name, whatever the god's name here is, and then the name of God is deleted, and you just have Moses. On the other hand, some ancient linguists, and I am not an ancient linguist, I'm not a scholar of Egyptian or Hebrew, it's not clear that Mosa in ancient Egyptian sounded sufficiently like Moshe in ancient Hebrew to actually conclusively argue for an Egyptian origin of the name. So it's not entirely clear what the origin is, but there's this interesting connection to Egyptian. So let's look at this story and think about this story. So here's the daughter, kind of a romantic painting, more modern painting, a daughter of Pharaoh, and the little baby Moses that is has been found in his basket. This story of the baby putting put upon a water in a basket to save its life is perhaps too good an origin story not to reuse, and certainly it's not original to Moses. In fact, Sargon the Great himself, the king of Akkad, king of Mesopotamia, of Iraq, who ruled in the 23rd century BCE, in other words, more than 1,600 years before the Exodus story is written. He explains his rise from humble origins. He says, "My mother, the high priestess, conceived. In secret she bore me. She sent me in a basket of rushes. With bitumen she sealed my lid. She cast me into the river which rose over me." So Sargon was also has a origin story of being put on a basket and found in a basket in order to be raised and become his rise ultimately to being the great king. So where does the 2200 BC in the Simpsons episode come from? So as we look at all of the imagery in the little Simpsons clip, everything is frame for frame copying Cecil B. DeMille's 1953 classic, The Ten Commandments, with Charlton Heston as Moses, and Yul Brynner as the Pharaoh. Yul Brynner is playing Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great, one of the most famous Egyptian pharaohs, the pharaoh for whom the poem Ozymandias is named. So Ozymandias is a Greek version of the name Ramesses. Look on me, my works ye mighty, and despair. So the Ten Commandments, the movie in 1956, is set during the reigns of Seti I and then Ramses II. So Ramses II, we know from, not from the Bible, but from Egyptian records, ruled from about 1279 to 1213 BC, before the Common Era. And so then the Exodus story is set at the end of his reign, and so this is how the Simpsons authors did the math in order to decide that that period at the Exodus at Mount Sinai is taking place around 1220, if this is to be believed. Unfortunately, this gets us to one of the central anachronisms for the Exodus if it had been a historical story. Although it is written in an era when Canaan, when Israel and Judah and the surrounding areas were or had recently been independent of Egypt and independent before being conquered by Assyria and Babylon, the Exodus story is actually set, if we go to the 13th century BCE, that's set in an era when Egypt ruled Canaan directly. So Ramesses, in addition to being one of the great pharaohs of all time, he's also leading Egypt when it has a more extensive control and empire and is dealing directly with the Hittites and has a essentially imperial colonial possession over Canaan and Philistia and Phoenicia. It's not Philistia yet, so Canaan in this time period. So Moses would not actually have been leading anybody to freedom from Egyptian control if he left from Egypt proper, wandered around Sinai and in the desert for 40 years, and then came back out, and they ended up in Canaan. They just find themselves still within the Egyptian empire, since at this time period, the time period when the Exodus is set, Egypt actually continues to rule that territory. So Exodus could not have occurred at the time it's set, and that's just one of many anachronisms in the story, which leads, I think, almost all scholars to conclude that it could not have happened as it's written. There's always a lot of people who would like there to be a kernel of truths, but in other words, not a giant nation of people. Maybe there's a little group of people, something like that. You can always speculate about things like that. There's no archaeological way to disprove that kind of a negative. So what about a kernel behind the myth? So there are no Egyptian records for like a huge number of people, like as described in Exodus leaving. with that kind of a major revolt. The Hittites might also mention something about it. There's no extra biblical records of it. As we say, the Exodus is anachronistic, did not occur as written. Nevertheless, what would have been the case is when the Exodus story or sources for it are first being written, maybe around the time of Jeremiah, the name Moses was known. So he was known and remembered as a great prophet. And it's possible Jeremiah and his entire group of priests and prophets that are potentially exiles or related to the northern kingdom, the priests of Shiloh, the tradition that comes that they remember about Samuel. Jeremiah may consider his family's eponymous ancestor to be Moses. So he may well have viewed him as a hero ancestor, the same way that the Aaronid high priests of Jerusalem considered Aaron to be their ancestor. The stories about Moses and Aaron are written from people who just know the name of an eponymous ancestor, the same way they're writing about David, not because of any necessarily any records that they have. And this is why the stories written down at a later time are anachronistic. So other associations is that Moses is associated with the law at the time that the stories that become the Torah are composed. So there may have been a historical Moses. We can't say one way or the other. Nevertheless, what we can say is none of the stories associated with them are historical as written in the Torah. I think that part of when we take origin stories, identity stories like these, one of the things that humans naturally do is they want to, when they want to find a kernel of the history, they want to read the story as we have it, and then they want to historicize it. And so the way they do that for thousands of years, I think, is that people then read the text that we have it, like the parting of the Red Sea. And then they want to say, well, what is a naturalistic explanation we can have for a story that has supernatural elements? In other words, in order to make this history, we have to either explain how such a thing could have happened or pretend that it didn't happen. And so maybe since the words here that they're crossing, they're saying they're crossing a reed sea, that it's not actually the Red Sea that is so large. Maybe it's a smaller lake somehow, and so it's therefore less of a big deal that it parts. Maybe there was like a huge natural phenomenon that happens with winds, or there's a tsunami that causes all the water to pull back before it crashes forward and kills Pharaoh. None of those explanations has any value. So in all of these kinds of things, when people are trying to explain or historicize myths, because the story is literary, it's not an eyewitness story of something that happened, it's a story written, hundreds of years later, and it's written with the purpose of having a supernatural element happen. So trying to create a natural explanation for a literary supernatural event misunderstands the literary purpose of the identity story. And so I think we shouldn't be looking for those kinds of things. Instead, we should be looking for what is the meaning of the story, not try to historicize the story. Okay, so those are kind of the backgrounds about Moses and Exodus that I think we need to start with before we can do a deep dive into the Ten Commandments, which I want to now do. And so the Ten Commandments there's a lot of props of these. There's a lot of statues. This is a fun thing that people want to make, statues of, and there's a popular thing that Christian conservatives have in the United States where they make a monument of this and they want to put it on public property in order to try to erode the separation of church and state, which is to say it's actually to try to eliminate the constitutional freedom of religion by imposing a state religion. Right? That's what the separation of church and state is, freedom of religion. And so anyway, but this is nevertheless something that happens. And so you can see them often, they look like on the left. You can, it's much more what you would think of that Hebrew looks like. This is how Hebrew, if you're familiar with the modern Hebrew, the abjad, kind of looks like that, whereas you can see on the right, that doesn't really look like how Hebrew is written at all. In fact, that's because once the nobility of Judah get taken to Babylon and are in the Babylonian captivity, and then they come back and are part of the Persian Empire, they adopt the Aramaic abjad. So I say abjad, that's an alphabet that doesn't have vowels. So these are written without vowels. So they adopt a modified, but more or less Aramaic abjad, and then Aramaic becomes their main written language. And so Hebrew, in later periods up till modern times, is written in this Aramaic abjad, whereas the Ten Commandments, if there had been a historic artifact in the first temple period, which there might have been, that included the law, it would have been written in the Paleo Hebrew alphabet, abjad, once again it doesn't have any vowels, which is essentially identical to all of the other Canaanite scripts of the time, including Phoenician. So the Canaanites, the Israelites, the Ammonites, Moabites, Edomites, and the Phoenicians, and even the Philistines at this point, since they had also been speaking more or less the same language, they all have the same language in the kind of the Phoenician alphabet, which is why that looks like that on the right. I keep saying alphabet. I should say script or abjad. Okay, so the 5 books attributed to Moses, the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those are the names that we have in English from the Greek, but they also have Hebrew names based on the first words of each text in Hebrew. So the 5 books of Moses are also known as the Torah or Law, and they likely came together in their current form early on into the Second Temple period, maybe under Ezra, who was a Jewish priest and a scribe, who was appointed to serve as provincial administrator of Jerusalem during the Persian period, when Jerusalem is a Persian province, so in the middle of the 5th century before the Common Era. So although attributed to Moses, the texts post-date the time when Moses would have lived by many, many centuries. So at the earliest, they're really being written, some of the source texts maybe right around the time of Jeremiah, which is to say right before the end of the First Temple period. But actually, lots of scholars actually argue for a much later date, so into the exile and Second Temple period even. So along with pre-biblical fragments, there are a number of distinct voices within the Pentateuch, and so these have been identified by scholars for the last 2 centuries as the J, E, P, and D sources. The J is the Yahwist, the E is the Elohist, P, the priestly source, and D, the Deuteronomist. And so the Deuteronomist is the author of Deuteronomy, which is kind of a distinct book out of the Torah, and that text is associated with the next books of the Bible, the Deuteronomistic histories, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. So those are all sort of hanging together and part of a school that has a lot of themes in common with Jeremiah. The priestly source is the long, boring part where it's just this ongoing, unending description of rituals and vessels and all of these things. It's written by priests associated with the temple in Jerusalem and just obsessed with its rituals and its, all of its vessels and how it should all be arranged and everything like that. The priestly source is written also by or on behalf of someone who considers themselves to be a descendant of Aaron. So the priests of Jerusalem are the Aaronid priests, the priests who are descended from Aaron's great-great-grandson and so forth under David, Zadok, eventually becoming the Zadokites, the Sadducees. And so then the Yahwist and Elohist sources are different. They are seemingly not written by priests the way the priestly source of the Deuteronomist is, and instead seem to be maybe court literature, with the Yahwist reflecting folk imagery of the southern kingdom, of the kingdom of Judah, and the Elohist reflecting some of the folk heroes and geography and values of the northern kingdom. And so they're named for the use of how they use the name of God, with the Yahwist from the very beginning calling God by God's name, Yahweh or Jehovah, which is why it's called the J source, Jehovist, Yahwist. And then the Elohist, whose hero is Moses. God does not reveal that name in the story at all until we get to Sinai, where God talks to Moses, and Moses says, what shall I call you? What's your name? Everyone won't believe that I talked to you unless you tell. And then the name Yahweh is revealed to Moses. So one of the ways that these different texts are divided is that they even in English translation, they have very, very different tones and very different types of words that they use. And so and we'll get to how this is explained, but even without explanation, the tone and language and even word choice changes very markedly at different sections of the Torah, of the Pentateuch. And in the Exodus story, in the Ten Commandments story, that's especially evident, for example, when Moses goes to God's mountain in order to receive the Ten Commandments. In the J and the P portions of the text, that mountain is called Mount Sinai, and it's called that 20 times. And when Moses in those books is talking to, in the J source, is talking to his father-in-law, he's known as Reuel. However, in the E source and in the Deuteronomy, the mountain of God is called either Mountain of God or it's called Mount Horeb. And so they're never used as synonyms, they're never used together. It's one or the other. And same thing in the Elohist source, when Moses' father-in-law is present, he's called Jethro. And so if you've watched the movie The Ten Commandments, it calls the mountain Sinai, because I think that's the name that we almost all use. We rarely all say Mount Horeb. We almost all say Mount Sinai. But usually Jethro, is the father-in-law's name. But again, in some of the texts, it's Reuel. Okay, so how are these different voices explained? So today now, there's no scholarly consensus to explain why there are these different voices. So it's clear that there are different voices, which are all intermingled in the Torah, except for D, the Deuteronomist, which is really just the book of Deuteronomy as its own separate thing. So traditionally, the documentary hypothesis was one of the major ways, and it still remains one of the major ways, to explain how these all came together. And the idea of this is there are 4 essentially independent sources: the Yahwist source, the Elohist source, the priestly source, and the Deuteronomist. In other words, they're not literally dependent, although they are aware of each other. And these are combined together by various R's, by various redactors. And so the earliest potentially are J and E, which are combined together early on by an early redactor. That JE source maybe was known to the Deuteronomist and the priestly writer, or maybe not. Anyway, they are coming in around the same time, but they're not literally dependent on one another, and those wrote their own counter version of the story, one that maybe is more religious, in the priestly author's case, much more religious, one that has different core values. So in the Elohist, and even in the Yahwist, but especially in the Elohist, Moses is the hero, whereas for the priestly author, of course, their ancestor, Aaron, should be the hero. And so Aaron is substantially elevated. He's made into Moses' brother, which he had not been in the other versions. So those then are all brought together by a final redactor around the time of Ezra into the Pentateuch that we have now, the 5 books of Moses as they presently exist in the Second Temple period up to this day. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is essentially a supplementary hypothesis. So maybe there essentially was an original kernel, the Yahwist source, which was one book, that then somebody got a hold of that and they decided to expand it and write their own parts. And so that's the Elohist, and that person expanded it to being larger. Then with that JE book that was expanded together, the priestly author gets a hold of it, doesn't like a lot of things, but respects the book enough to not change it, and instead just simply adds a counter narrative to it. And then a final redactor brings that supplemented text of J plus E plus P kind of added together with Deuteronomy to create the Pentateuch. So that's another way of explaining how these distinct voices exist. So there's other, like I say, other explanations about how this could happen. But the main point is that there are very distinct voices within the Pentateuch. And so specifically, especially, the priestly author is very apparent, as is the Yahwist author. The Elohist is harder to decide or to make the case, although some scholars do, that it's a fully distinct voice and could have ever been separated as its own text. So, however it came together, because it's composed of multiple voices, the Pentateuch frequently includes doublets or even triplets. In other words, the same story told multiple times. And so a famous one in Genesis, when we did our lecture on who wrote Genesis, is where Abraham, during a famine, goes to stay with Pharaoh. And because his wife, Sarah, is so beautiful, and because she's also his half-sister, he tells Pharaoh, well, she's my sister, so that Pharaoh won't simply kill him to take his wife from him. But then Pharaoh has the potential for dishonoring himself by essentially having an affair with a married woman, or potentially having an affair with a married woman. That same story is told again in a doublet, where Abraham does the same thing when he goes and meets King Abimelech of the Philistines, a completely anachronistic story, since the Philistines wouldn't have been around in Canaan at the time of Abraham. And there's then again another variant of the story where Isaac also then visits Abimelech and tells him that his wife Rebekah is his sister, a story that was too good to not keep telling it, but nevertheless, it doesn't make any sense with Isaac and Rebekah, because they're not actually sisters. And anyway, it doesn't. So in any event, it's anachronistic and it doesn't work anymore. Those are, though, probably because multiple sources have been added together, so there's doublets and triplets. The Pentateuch contains 3 versions of the story where Moses receives the 10 Commandments. And it also has 3 different versions of the text of the 10 Commandments. So these occur in Exodus 20, in Exodus 34, and then in Deuteronomy 5. So we'll look at all of these in a lot of depth. Richard Elliott Friedman, who is a big proponent still of the documentary hypothesis, he argues that the commandments in Exodus 20, that the list is not written in any of the major voices, and so likely represents an independent document that the biblical redactor used to bring things together. So it's just maybe an independent pre-biblical document of the 10 Commandments. And these are the ones that are most familiar perhaps to us. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether it is in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on earth below, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the thousandth generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. So, in addition to communal guilt or guilt of your ancestors being promised here, this commandment, as we've seen a bunch of times, reflects monolatry. So God isn't saying, I am the only God, there is no other God but me. And the concept here that the people have at the time this document is written is that there are multiple gods, but the people are to worship a single God. And so there may be other things that are other gods that are in heaven above, or in Hades below, in the waters below the earth, in the primordial chaos waters, or on the earth even. Those you shall not serve them, just you're supposed to only serve Yahweh, to God. So you shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath day to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. So here, anyway, in terms of Sabbath observance, we're going to have the explanation for why this happens from P's creation story. And so as it goes on to explain about the Sabbath, it says, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it." So even though this text maybe it's not from any of the major voices, it nevertheless is aware of the priestly creation story that's in Genesis 1:1. This is the one that's very familiar to all of us, the first creation story, where over the course of 6 days, God creates, says, "Let there be light," and there is light, this cosmic creation story. So 6 days the Lord worked and he rests on the Sabbath. That's the explanation for resting on the Sabbath in this version of the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20. The commandments go on: "Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land of the Lord, land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, male or female slave, ox, donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." So, in general, if we take this Exodus 20 version and then we look at the version that's found in Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomist version, Deuteronomy 5, it's almost entirely the same. We have the same list of commandments, but the exception is the explanation for the Sabbath. So in Deuteronomy we read, "Observe the Sabbath day, keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to your Lord God. You shall not do any work. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." So for the Deuteronomist anyway, the Sabbath is a commemoration of Israel's bondage in Egypt. Although, as a commemoration, it doesn't make as much sense, right? So you can see why, if God, in a cosmic sense, rests on a cosmic Sabbath during the creation, that can be recalled by you. It's not like the Exodus took place on only 6 days and then they rested on a seventh. It's just they're setting aside this as a holiday to remember the Exodus. So the tablets themselves are first mentioned in the story in Exodus chapter 24. So just a few chapters after that first list that we read in depth was given in Exodus 20. So in that component of the story, which I'm having here in yellow text because it's often identified as an E source, an Elohist source, the Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there. I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment which I have written for their instruction." So Moses set out with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up onto the mountain of God. To the elders he had said, "Wait here for us until we come back to you. Look, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a dispute may go to them." So Friedman again identifies, like I say, this part as being an Elohist source, and it continues, the narrative continues after a long P source description about a bunch of priestly stuff. The story begins again in Exodus 32. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make gods for us. Who shall go before us? As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him. He's been gone for 40 days. Aaron said to them, "Take off the gold rings that are on your ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took these from them, formed them in a mold, and cast them into a calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." So this is a really strange story. This is the story that we're seeing at the beginning of the Simpsons episode, where they'll have the graven image, actually in this case a cast image of a calf, which the maker of graven images was busy polishing in the Simpsons story, and it happens in the movie The Ten Commandments. Aaron is making this. Nevertheless, even though there's just simply a golden calf, a little bull, the thing that Aaron says is, "These are your gods, plural, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." So that mirrors a story told in the first book of Kings, chapter 12, where King Jeroboam of Israel, so the king of the northern kingdom, who is portrayed by the Deuteronomist as an evil king, a king who is opposed to Yahweh worship, Jeroboam makes 2 calves out of gold, and he puts one at the shrine at Bethel, at the southern boundary of the kingdom of Israel, and it's kind of right next to Jerusalem, which is the northern boundary of the southern kingdom. And then he puts the other one in Dan, which is at the very northern frontier of the kingdom of Israel. And when he does that, Jeroboam declares, there's 2 of them in this case, "Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." So clearly, the stories are meant to echo one another, and maybe here, the Jeroboam story is actually older. I mean, they're all maybe around the same time, but that Aaron is, the story here about Aaron is maybe meant to cast aspersions on Aaron and certainly echo Jeroboam's calves. So just looking at these different stories, these different narrators within the Torah, J, P, E, and D, they have different perspectives and different focuses. So whereas the Yahweh source focuses on locations and folk heroes of Judah, the southern kingdom, the Elohist source is focused on the northern kingdom and is busily connecting negative practices associated with the northern shrine, so Bethel and Dan. You can see them here at the north and south borders of Israel, connecting those with Aaron. So the priestly source, P, like I said, who was written by an Aaronid priest, one of the high priests of Jerusalem, who consider Aaron to be their ancestor, they do not include any story about Aaron making a golden calf. That is not there. Instead, the priestly source is very much interested in elevating Aaron and constantly puts Aaron together with Moses. Moses and Aaron stood before the congregation, will always happens in the priestly text. And indeed, it's the priestly story which makes Aaron into Moses' brother. The other authors don't seem to make that association. So, as the golden calf story in Exodus continues, the Lord is becoming extremely angry with Moses' people. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down at once. Your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt, have acted perversely." You know, it's when God calls Moses and tells him to go to the land, he says, "My people, I've heard the call of my people, you know, and I'm sending you to them to take them out." Now that they're wicked again, God is angry with them. He's saying, "No, these are those are your people." It's like the parents who, when the kid does well, he's my son, but when he does a mistake, he's your son, that kind of thing. So they have been quick to turn aside from the way that I commanded them. They have cast for themselves an image of a calf, and they've worshipped it, and they've sacrificed to it. Then Moses turned and went down from the mountain, carrying the 2 tablets of the covenant in his hands, tablets that were written on both sides, written on the front and the back. The tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God engraved upon the tablets. As soon as he came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tablets from his hands, and he broke them at the foot of the mountain. So Moses destroys the tablets of the 10 Commandments, he smashes the tablets of the 10 Commandments that God made with God's own hand, according to the Elohist narrative. So, at the time, the biblical sources were being composed, or the earliest stories, so the very end of the First Temple period, after the fall of the Northern Kingdom, at the time of Hezekiah and Josiah, and that kind of time period in the Southern Kingdom of Jerusalem, the tablets of the law, as I say, were the key artifact held in the Jerusalem temple. So the Ark of the Covenant includes either whole tablets or pieces of the tablets. And so these are under the control of the Aaronid priesthood, the high priests that are in charge of that temple. So the author here, the Elohist author, by portraying Aaron as a heretic, he doesn't say no. He doesn't do it against. They're not threatening him or anything like that. He's a ready participant in this idolatry where he creates the golden calf. By doing that, and also by stating that Moses smashed the tablets, the real tablets, the Elohist author here is potentially saying, that artifact that the high priest says he has in the temple, I think that's a fake. It's got to be a fake because Moses smashed the real tablets, so those are not the real ones. So Moses then destroys the golden calf. He grinds it to dust, and that's, again, a mirror of that same story, the way King Josiah of Judah destroys the golden calf that he finds at the northern shrine of Bethel, so that same calf that King Jeroboam had made. Obviously, he only gets the southern one because Dan is far too far away for an unimportant king like the king of Jerusalem to be able to access. That's way too deep into Assyrian territory at that time. So with the tablets destroyed in the Elohist narrative, if there is a redactor or however the Torah is being compiled, a later editor may have used the Yahwist version of the story to explain the replacement tablets in the story in Exodus 34. So if we get now to the Yahwist version or the J version of the story, we read in Exodus 34, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Cut 2 tablets of stone like the former ones, and I will write on the tablets the words that were on the former tablets which you broke.'" So again, according to Friedman, that underlined part is an addition of the redactor who is trying to take a doublet, which is to say there was already the Elohist story of the tablets, now we're getting the Yahweh story of the tablets, but by pulling them together, the redactor adds this little detail to say that this is going to be replacement ones. So Moses cut 2 tablets of stone like the former ones, and he rose up early in the morning and went up on Mount Sinai as the Lord had commanded him, and he took in his hands the 2 tablets of stone. So what follows then is the Yahwist or J version of the Mosaic Covenant and the Yahwist version of the list of the 10 Commandments, which, as we will see, is very different indeed from the familiar ones that I already read, from the Deuteronomist and from the one that is familiar anywhere that may have been edited by the priestly author or redactor. So we read in Exodus here from the Yahweh source, the Lord said, I hereby make a covenant before all your people. I will perform marvels such as have not been done in all the earth or in any nation, and all the people among you whom you live shall see the work of the Lord, for it is an awesome thing that I will do with you. Observe what I command you today. See, I will drive out before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. So he's going to destroy all of the people in the land, the promised land that he's going to give to them. Take care not to make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you are going, or it will become a snare among you. Rather, you shall tear down their altars, break their pillars, and cut down their sacred poles, their asherim, the groves that they are using to worship the goddess Asherah. For you shall worship no other God, because the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. You shall not make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, for when they prostitute themselves to their gods and sacrifice to their gods, someone among them will invite you, and you will eat of the sacrifice, and you will take wives from among their daughters for your sons, and their daughters who prostitute themselves to their gods will make your sons also prostitute themselves to their gods. So we got to stay apart from all of these folks if we're going to continue to have monolatry, because any intermarriage is going to bring all of the rest of the pantheon here. Next commandment, you shall not make cast idols. Next commandment, you shall keep the festival of the unleavened bread, Passover. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, as I commanded you, at the time appointed in the month of Abib. For in the month of Abib you came out from Egypt. So I'm just going to note here, we saw in the one Ten Commandments list, the Sabbath observance being justified as a commemoration of the Exodus, and it didn't really make as much sense. Now this makes more sense that you're going to celebrate the Passover as a commemoration of Exodus, since the Passover, has to do with the killing of the firstborn of Egypt, and so this commandment is to keep the Passover. Number 19. All that first opens the womb is mine, all your male livestock, the firstborn of cow and sheep, the firstborn of a donkey or a lamb. A donkey you shall redeem with a lamb, or if you will not redeem it, you shall break its neck. All the firstborn of your sons you shall redeem. And so we've talked about this, how in the pre-Yahwist, the Canaanite paganism, there is an idea that firstborn, there has to be a sacrifice, and that extends even to human sacrifice. And the idea of the Passover is not, and even the idea of Abraham sacrificing Isaac is not that God is asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, but rather religious reformers are saying, no, what we need to do is redeem the firstborn, which is to say you sacrifice a sheep or a ram instead of human children. We're not going to do that anymore. That's not, or God doesn't want you to do that. This is what had been done religiously before. Nevertheless, the first, all that opens the womb is mine. So that part of the understanding of the religion is maintained and is one of the Ten Commandments here. But nevertheless, it is not. There is the idea of a redeeming. So you don't actually, certainly don't do human sacrifice. That instead you have animal sacrifice. No one shall appear before me empty-handed. 6 days you shall work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Even in the plowing time and in the harvest time you shall rest. Next commandment, you shall observe the festival of weeks. the first fruits of the wheat harvest, and the festival of ingathering at the turn of the year. 3 times in the year all your males shall appear before the Lord your God, the God of Israel, for I will cast out nations before you and enlarge your borders. No one shall covet your land when you go up to appear before the Lord your God 3 times in the year. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leaven, and the sacrifice of the festival of the Passover shall not be left until the morning. The best of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring to the house of the Lord your God, and you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. So this is a very different list of 10 commandments. It's not pretty much, we're missing out on all of those. Honor your mother and father, thou shalt not steal, you shall not bear false witness, all those things. Instead, these are a lot more about rituals. So this is a covenant that you need to keep in terms of what kind of festivals and other things and sacrifices you need to be making. A different and potentially actually earlier, maybe the first list, the earliest list that we have anyway of the 10 Commandments. Then the Lord said to Moses, write these words, for in accordance with these words I have made a covenant with you and Israel. He was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He neither ate bread nor drank water, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. So yeah, if you think I was taking those out of context and say that's not the 10 Commandments, no, it's very clear here explicitly that this is the words that were written on the tablets of the covenant, and they are explicitly called the 10 Commandments. And yet, as we see, what I just read, is very unfamiliar. Nobody knows those as the 10 Commandments. Everybody is much more focused on the lists, the very different variations found in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. The only overlap between the two lists are the commandments to worship no other God than Yahweh, the commandment against worshiping certain types of idols, and the commandment in favor of Sabbath observance. The 2 different kinds of idols are on the one hand labeled graven images and the other are cast idols. So the JSource version explicitly forbids cast idols, which would forbid the Northern Kingdom's golden calves, since those are cast, but would allow the golden cherubim that are in the Jerusalem temple. Since they're not cast, they are made out of wood and then are simply covered with plated gold plate. And so inside the Holy of Holies in Solomon's temple, as it's described, the Ark of the Covenant has itself 2 little golden cherubim on it, and there are cherubim that are guarding it. And in some sense, I think this is sort of quibbling over national shrines, because in both cases, both the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom have a lot of their focus on Yahweh, but are also worshiping other gods. And their understanding of Yahweh as their national God is that Yahweh is not pictured, but Yahweh's presence is felt by sitting on a mercy seat. So in the case of the Jerusalem temple, this is a little tiny seat that is where the wings of the cherubs have, and so then God's presence is here in the Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple. For the kingdom of Israel, those 2 golden bulls for Yahweh are at either side of the kingdom. And the idea is that the presence of God isn't sitting inside a little temple, it's sitting across the entire nation, and the seat is on either side where those 2 bulls are. So I think in both cases they're trying to accomplish something similar, but they just are, the Judahites, so the Southern Kingdom is reinterpreting the Northern Kingdom's version of it as idolatry. So whatever the text might have been, so I have those 2 different lists, and we can only speculate about which is earliest. So we don't have the whatever fragments, or if there were whole versions of the covenant tablets in the Ark of the Covenant, whether that was intact or just in fragments in the Ark during the the first temple period, that's all gone when the Babylonians destroy Solomon's temple in 586 BCE. So the ark is lost, and everything that is in it is lost, and none of that exists when they build the new temple, Ezra's temple. Zerubbabel's temple, Ezra's temple, and then later Herod's temple do not contain the ark or the tablets, which are lost. So in addition to that wholly separate list of 10 commandments that we have from the Yahweh source, most everybody discounts that and doesn't use that list, but instead use the other lists. Nevertheless, it's not. Everybody isn't agreed as to which one. There's 10 commandments. We all agree about that. But what are they? Which are the which 10? So that beginning segment about the Simpsons, it was Homer versus the 8th commandment, and the 8th commandment is "Thou shalt not steal," according to the Simpsons. Nevertheless, that's not how everybody numbers it. So if we look at the text, which I put in the right-hand column here, "Thou shalt not steal," you can kind of go down the list and see "Thou shalt not steal." Well, that's the 8th commandment in the Jewish, rabbinic Judaism, in the Hebrew Bible, the way that the rabbis count. It's the 8th commandment in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and it's the 8th commandment for Calvinists, so people in Reformed Protestant churches. But it's the 7th commandment for example, Catholics and Lutherans. So the counting is different, how they're grouped. So for some groups, the part where it begins, "I am the Lord thy God," that is just a prefatory statement. That's not a commandment. But for the rabbis, that's a commandment. That's the first commandment. For the Catholics, that's part of the first commandment, but all of that stuff, that "I'm the Lord thy God, you won't have any gods before me, you shall not make any graven images," that's all part of the first commandment for the Catholics. And so anyway, there's a preference, and then the Lutherans, that's the first commandment, and so on. You can kind of see how they're numbered. And then the other place where the groupings, where you make up for any grouping that you've missed in the beginning, is at the end with all the coveting, right? So for the Calvinists and for Jews, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thy neighbor's wife, his slaves, his animals, anything to do with thy neighbor." All that coveting is just one commandment. But for the other traditions, they split up. There's like 2 different coveting commandments depending on how they split it up. So the Eastern Orthodox and the Lutherans kind of agree that your neighbor's house is kind of one and all the other coveting is the other, whereas the Catholics separate out your neighbor's wife as a special thing not to covet, and then house and slaves, animals, and property is together. It's kind of at least putting women on a higher platform than slaves, animals, and property. So I kind of like the Catholic breakdown of that comparatively, or Jewish and Calvinist, where all that coveting is just one commandment. But in any event, the numbering is not. No one agrees about how to number these 10. We agree that there's 10, but they are ordered differently, depending on the different traditions. There's also some variations. And so, for example, the Samaritans have a different 10th commandment. The Samaritans are heirs to that northern kingdom of Israel that we've been talking about, that had been centered on the city of Samaria, which is why they're called Samaritans, and who did not, the Samaritan kingdom, the Samarian kingdom, had those shrines at Bethel and at Dan, but there was also a temple near the capital, near the city of Shechem, at Mount Gerizim. So the Samaritan Pentateuch includes a 10th commandment that is very, very different from the Jewish or the Christian version of the text. It reads, "And it shall come to pass, when the Lord thy God will bring thee into the land of the Canaanites, whither thou goest to take possession of it, thou shalt erect unto thee 3 large stones, and thou shalt cover them with lime, and thou shalt write upon the stones all the words of the law. And it shall come to pass, when ye cross the Jordan, ye shall erect these stones, which I command thee, upon Mount Gerizim, And thou shalt build there an altar unto the Lord thy God, and thou shalt bring upon it burnt offerings to the Lord thy God, and thou shalt sacrifice peace offerings, and thou shalt eat there and rejoice before the Lord thy God. That mountain is on the other side of the Jordan, at the end of the road towards the going down of the sun, in the land of the Canaanites who dwell in the Arabah, facing Gilgal, close to Elon Moreh, facing Shechem. So, in other words, Mount Gerizim next to Shechem in Canaan, in what becomes the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom. So you can kind of see on the map here, I put Mount Gerizim next to Shechem, which is next to the main northern kingdom capital, Samaria. And so probably the northern kingdom, again, was where the original monolatry, the biblical traditions, the earliest biblical traditions really got going, and it's only when, and the kings were centralizing things at their shrines, Dan and Bethel, but also at a temple, Mount Gerizim. And it's only after the Assyrians destroy that Jerusalem really rises, when it becomes part of the Assyrian economic system, and it is allowed to grow, and it also receives northern exiles, and almost all of the biblical writing really takes place in that flowering of time right before the destruction of Jerusalem. So today there are still Samaritans, and here they are celebrating a Passover on Mount Gerizim in Palestine, but only maybe 874 remain. So the Samaritans have contracted to a very small number indeed. I'll just mention there are other very interesting variants on the Ten Commandments. So there is a factional Mormon prophet, James J. Strang, who made his claim to lead the Latter-day Saint tradition churches after the death of Mormon church founder Joseph Smith. So Strang claimed to translate a new book of scripture from an ancient set of plates that were from Jerusalem, according to him, from right before the destruction of Jerusalem. And his translation is called the Book of the Law of the Lord, which was published in 1851. And so the focus of his book, the focus of the book as it's translated or as he wrote it, is a restored version of the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue. And so that includes, as he called it, restoring or inserting a new fourth commandment, which is, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. So part of the impetus of later, Joseph Smith's later time, and certainly of much of the Latter-day Saint movement, is trying to bring Christianity back into closer contact with Old Testament stuff, and by making the Ten Commandments include the second great commandment of Jesus, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. This implies, or the implication of it is that everything was always the same. The Old Covenant and the New Covenant are essentially one. So this is just part of the attempts by Christians to reconcile the Old and New Covenants, the Old Testament and the New Testament. So as with the Samaritans, there are only a tiny number of Strangite Mormons still to this day, but they continue to study Strang's Book of the Law of the Lord as a book of scripture. So in addition to correcting some of Joseph Smith's late Nauvoo theological speculation, so one of Joseph Smith's ideas is that God the Father is a totally separate being from Jesus and from the Holy Spirit. There's not just one God in Trinity, they are three separate beings, and so therefore it's a rejection of monotheism, and that God the Father was once a human being like us, and that humans will eventually progress to be divine. So that's Joseph Smith's kind of late Nauvoo theological speculation. It's still part of the Utah Mormon progression theology today. Strang fixes that by going back to monotheism, and instead asserts that a kind of a Christology of adoptionism. So essentially, God is God, there's one God. Jesus is the first exalted divine human, and so he is adopted essentially by God to become divine, and that's a plan for all of us. We can all become divine the way Jesus did, but we'll all be divine in a lesser way than God, who is the one monotheist God with a capital G. So that's Strang's attempting to reconcile Old and New Covenants for Christians. It's not just within Mormonism that this has been a question. So since the time of Paul, the relevance of Old Testament law, including the Ten Commandments, has been called into question in Christianity. So we saw a later leader in Christians in the 3rd century, or 2nd century and 3rd, who admired Paul Marcion, 2nd century, who wanted to reject the Old Testament altogether, strip it out of the canon, and also a lot of the non-Paul parts of the New Testament because of their dependence on Old Testament law, so that it could be an entirely kind of a New Covenant Christianity. So precisely what constituted adherence to Jewish law in early 1st century Galilee was in flux. So a lot of times, it's very right to assert that Jesus and all of his disciples and companions are Jewish. They are Jewish, but they're not Jewish. They're not rabbinic Jewish. We shouldn't be anachronistic and have them follow, for example, all 613 commandments later enumerated by the rabbis in ways that the rabbis asserted that you should do that. Instead, they had some level of adherence to Jewish law different from that. And so as a result of that, there's a lot of arguments that are sometimes made about the historical Jesus that we could argue from later rabbinic interpretation of Jewish law that Jesus, if he's a rabbi, he had to be married because rabbis have to be married, or he had to wear his beard and not shave his beard, and so he was bearded. We don't know either of those things. There's no evidence for either of those, and that's that would be a later part of the law that maybe is how it's interpreted, but that might not have been in keeping with practice in Galilee among even observant Jews like Jesus. So we have many stories and sayings about Jesus that argue in favor of a spiritual interpretation of the law as opposed to literal adherence. And nevertheless, the historical Jesus, his family, his movement, absolutely, they certainly adhered to some practices of Jewish law. So including for the men being circumcised, there was some kind of Sabbath adherence, although Jesus was continuously practicing a more spiritual understanding of the Sabbath, as opposed to very fixed rules about what you shouldn't do. There would have been some dietary restrictions that they're following, and they certainly are participating in some festivals, since the Last Supper and the Passion, the Crucifixion, are all very associated with the Passover. The whole reason they're presumably in Jerusalem when they're from Galilee is that they have attended there because of this festival observance. So there's a component of observance of Jewish law that is occurring with the historical Jesus in the beginning of the Jesus movement, proto-Christianity. So as we saw in our lecture on Paul just 2 weeks ago, why Paul's churches won, Paul was an innovator in that he taught non-Jewish converts to the faith that they didn't have to adhere to Jewish law in order to become Christians. And so this teaching that Paul had, this insight that he had, brought him into conflict with Jesus' brother James, who led a church group in Jerusalem, and also the leading disciple of Jesus, the historical Jesus, Peter, who Paul talks about confronting on at least a couple occasions. So Paul, in writing his letters, when he is embattled about this, at different times he castigates his opponents as the circumcision faction. He considers that to be nonsense and atrocity you shouldn't do, and he even jokes that he wishes that that they would have gone on and fully emasculate themselves. So he's really making body arguments at a certain point because he's angry enough with his enemies. So in his second letter to the Corinthians, when he is concerned that he's losing control of this Christian community that he himself had founded, Paul feels that he has to defend himself against accusations from rival apostles that he doesn't have any apostolic authority, since these rival apostles have ID cards, essentially. They have letters of recommendation that is confirming that they have apostolic authority, and he doesn't say where they got these from, but presumably these are letters that somebody like Peter or somebody like James has said, I'm sending you this to talk about such and such the apostle, and he has my personal confirmation that he has received apostolic authority from me. So to the Corinthians, Paul writes, "Surely we do not need, as some do, letters of recommendation to you or from you, do we? You yourselves, you Corinthians, are our letter, written on our hearts, known and read by all. And you show that you are a letter of Christ, prepared by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets that are human hearts." So Paul's authority is written by the Spirit of the living God on human hearts, and he is against both these letters of recommendation, these IDs from other humans, but he's also casting some shade here on tablets of stone. He continues, "Such is the confidence that we have through Christ towards God. Not that we are qualified of ourselves to claim anything is coming from us." This isn't just me. Our qualification is from God, who has made us qualified to be ministers of a new covenant, the New Testament. Not of the letter, not literally, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. So, this is a sharp indictment of literalism versus understanding the spirit of text. The letter kills. The New Testament, it's covenant. The new covenant spirit gives life, Paul says. Now, if the ministry of death, chiseled in letters on stone tablets, came in glory so that the people of Israel could not gaze on Moses' face because of the glory of his face, a glory now set aside, how much more will the ministry of the Spirit come in glory? For if there was glory in the ministry of condemnation, more does the ministry of justification abound in glory. Indeed, what once had glory has in this respect lost its glory because of the greater glory. For if what was set aside came through glory, how much more has the permanent come in glory? Wow, this is a harsh indictment of Old Testament, of Old Covenant, of Mosaic Law. The Mosaic Law here is ministry of death, chiseled in letters. It is ministry of condemnation. It's ministry that's been set aside. It's ministry that's lost its glory. It's ministry that is temporary, because it's something now has come from the Spirit that has greater glory. So in other words, the new covenant displaces all of this Mosaic tablet stuff. Since then, he says, we have such a hope, we act with complete frankness, not like Moses, who put a veil over his face to keep the people of Israel from gazing at the end of the glory that was being set aside. But their minds were hardened. Indeed, to this very day, when they hear the reading of the Old Covenant, that same veil is still there. It is not unveiled since Christ. It is not unveiled since in Christ it is set aside. Indeed, to this very day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their minds. But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. So using the story that Moses has to be veiled because his face is shining with God's glory, having been face to face with God. Now Paul is turning that story to say the old covenant, the Mosaic Law, is separating you from God like a veil. And the only way this veil that is clouding your minds and preventing you from seeing truth, the only way that that's going to be gotten rid of is when you turn from the old covenant to the new covenant. When you turn towards the Lord, then the veil is removed, when it turns towards Christ. Now, the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And all of us with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another, for this comes from the Lord, the Spirit. So, freedom in the New Testament, the new spiritual covenant. So this is a pretty strong condemnation by Paul of Old Covenant, of adherence to the law of Moses, which is, like I say, a ministry of death carved in stone tablets that are separating you from the Lord as though a veil was placed over your eyes or your mind. Nevertheless, even here, Paul also has stronger condemnations even than that. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul goes so far as to argue that if salvation could be earned by adhering to the law of Moses, the Old Covenant, then Christ died for nothing. He says if righteousness comes through law, through adhering to all of these laws, then Christ died for nothing. Christians should not be thinking this way, Paul says. He goes on to elaborate his view that everyone who's still living under the law is acting as if they are under a curse. For all who rely on the works of the law, everybody who's just adhering to all of these little legalisms, are under a curse. For it is written, "Cursed is everyone who does not observe and obey all the things written in the book of the law." Now it is evident that no one is reckoned as righteous before God by the law, for the one who is righteous will live by faith. But the law does not rest on faith. On the contrary, quote, "Whoever does the works of the law will live by them." So Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, "Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree." So the law says that if you were hanged on a tree, the way Christ is crucified on a cross, then you're cursed. Christ took on that curse in order to free us from the law, which is a curse. In order that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith, not through adherence to Old Testament law. Now, before faith came, we were imprisoned and guarded under the law until faith would be revealed. Therefore, the law was our disciplinarian until Christ came, so that we might be reckoned as righteous by faith, now that Christ has come. But now that faith has come, we are no longer subject to a disciplinarian. You don't have to adhere to this law anymore, for in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. As many of you as were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So Paul is pretty crystal clear. If you are a Christian, time for observing law is over. Ultimately, if you are insisting on quoting Old Testament laws as a Christian, then Christ died for nothing as far as Paul's concerned. That said, not all Christians agree. So not everybody agreed with Paul, which is one of the reasons why he's forced to voice his opinions so strongly. We've seen in previous lectures that Jesus' brother James, the just, and his church in Jerusalem continued to observe Jewish law. Another example is the Matthean community, who also had a contrary opinion, which their tradition in the Gospel of Matthew attributed to Jesus himself as part of the famous Sermon on the Mount. And so in that text, Jesus said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets," the Old Testament, in other words, which is divided into the law and the prophets and the writings. "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So for these Christians, for Christians in the Matthean community, every one of the commandments in the Old Testament, the law and the prophets, has to be obeyed. And if you teach people not to obey them, we're talking to you, Paul, you will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Or we'll even kick you out maybe of the kingdom of heaven. Law has to be obeyed as far as this community is concerned. And so and there's plenty more examples that we can read in the Bible that on both sides of this question. So Hebrews is very clear that the Old Testament has been superseded. James argues that you have to obey all the commandments. And there's plenty more examples. The competing positions in the New Testament have led to confusion among Christian groups ever since. Some Christians think that the Bible is written all in one voice and is not contradictory. It's very contradictory. It's arguing with itself. And so part of this is there's a dialogue, there is an argument, and you have to essentially come on one side or another, or you add your own voice and your own thinking into the dialogue. So some of us, like Paul, understand that Christians are not supposed to observe Jewish law. That is not how, that's the opposite of the meaning of the Christian covenant, and that's I would put myself in that camp. Nevertheless, there are other Christians, fundamentalists, who I think haphazardly imagine that all Old Testament commandments are to be read literally and applied literally, but then they don't read all of those commandments and they don't obey them all. They only quote a couple of them. They'll go and find a passage in Leviticus that they like in order to badmouth somebody who's doing something they don't like. But they're not following all the Levitical commandments. They're all eating pork. They're eating, they're not eating a kid in his mother's milk. In other words, they're not mixing beef and dairy products or something like that. They're not following laws the way conservative and Orthodox Judaism do. They're just quoting a couple of things out of Leviticus in order to judge others, And so, for example, here's a Christian counter-protester pointing out the hypocrisy, really, of cherry-picking Levitical law. So Leviticus says, no haircuts, but I guess we're skipping that one, So in other words, there's all these things that Leviticus says you can't do that are not actually being followed. In between those positions are actually a large number of Christians that have a kind of a compromised position. So maybe we should just obey the Ten Commandments. And so that's true, I think, for a lot of Christians who don't necessarily think that every Levitical law should be taught, but the Ten Commandments are. And sometimes that has caused, again, a kind of a literalism. So, for example, one of the Ten Commandments is keep the Sabbath day holy, and the Sabbath day is Saturday. Christians throughout time historically have worshipped on the Lord's Day, Sunday, the first day of the week. But some Christians who are wanting to focus on Ten Commandments, like the Adventists, switched to being Seventh-day Sabbatarians. And that actually is also true for the Strangite Mormons. So that restoration of the Ten Commandments by James Strang caused them to switch their day of worship from Sunday to Saturday. Other Christians say, no, well, it's okay, we'll keep the Ten Commandments, but we just cross out Sabbath and we say the Lord's Day for Sabbath, keep the Lord's Day holy, and we'll call the Lord's Day the new Sabbath. And then that allows them to still keep the Ten Commandments. And generally the Ten Commandments are perfectly fine. Don't kill, don't steal, honor your father and mother. Those kind of things are positive commandments. The point of it is not when the point of the New Covenant for Paul and those of us who don't think that you should be literally following Old Testament law is is not that there are not good principles that we are supposed to operate under, but it's just that we are not supposed to literalistically follow a rule book. We're supposed to be living by the Spirit in the new covenant. So that leads us, kind of brings us to the modern confusion through all of the other interesting roots of this whole tradition. And that is my general take on the Ten Commandments and the smashing thereof. So I'm going to have a drink of water while Leandro looks for some of your questions and maybe brings them to me. No worries. Okay. Unrecognized Talent asks, is it possible the historical Jesus never said anything that is recorded, whether or not the mythicist position is credible? Well, we're going to do Unrecognized Talent. We're going to do a whole lecture on this 2 weeks from now. So I'm going to talk about the the authenticity of the different sayings of Jesus, and so we'll look at what are the academic criteria that we're going to use to find different sayings and saying whether or not the degree to which any of them are authentic. So I would say no, it's not possible in general. There's some of these there is going to be some that we're going to be able to trace. Because it's not too far distant from in the time frame, but we'll go into it in a lot of depth in 2 weeks from now. So Ron Wagner asks, what's the earliest copy of the Torah? And so I presume you mean by that the manuscript. So we have fragments of the manuscript in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so those are early. So it's whatever that would be, 200 or 300 BC, before BCE, and so it's pretty early in. So there's some, we don't have an intact full copy. I think it might be the earliest full copy might be those the Codex Vaticanus and the Codex Sinaiticus, which is to say, yeah. So there's the earliest copies. The earliest full Hebrew copies are later, I think, than the full Greek copies by several centuries. Nevertheless, even though the rabbis are getting that together later, and the earliest manuscripts that we have are later than the earliest Christian Greek ones, what we found, I think, from the study of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we have fragments, is that there's a pretty good example of transmission. They're not being messed up. They had a good system for manuscript copying without distorting the text. Raymond Ortiz says, by telling the Israelites not to have other gods and that you're a jealous God, is God acknowledging the existence of other gods? So the idea of it is that the people, the prophets who are writing at the time, in other words, they are writing the human words in response to divine revelation. They understand there to be other gods, and so it is acknowledging. Yes, I think it is acknowledging the existence of other gods. It's not necessarily God acknowledging the existence of other gods, because it's human words always, and so it's the limitations of the humans at the time and what ideas that they have and are able to speak in as they are trying to channel inspiration from God. But anyway, yes, that's how it's read. And so if you literalistically believed it to be the words of God, that would be a problem for you. I want to thank people who've been contributing. So I want to thank Mark Long, Lewis Smart, Daryl Scott. Thank you so much for your donations, your support. That really helps us. Alpha Scav says, why it sounds more appropriate for a pharaoh to kill a husband to take a wife, but it isn't appropriate to kill a brother to take a sister. Why would that work? So yeah, we're going back to that Genesis story. He doesn't have to kill a brother to take his sister. He could just take the sister and give the brother treasure and a nice place to live in the palace and food and stuff, since it's a famine. So the idea of it is that he doesn't have to kill Abraham as a brother, because you can take the sister and marry her or bring her into your harem without killing her brother. You can actually you're kind of paying the brother off for having him give his sister to you. But that doesn't work if it's a wife. For the wife, you have to kill him to get him, or theoretically. so that's why it works. That's how the story works. It's tricking Pharaoh to make him think that it's a sister and not just a wife, not a wife and sister. Empress got a spiritual G says, do you think that Christianity is based on older spiritual beliefs and cultures, and did they corrupt spirituality? So Christianity and all religions are all based on older things that come before. So the ancient Israelite religion is itself pulling from earlier Israelite paganism and Canaanite paganism and earlier traditions that go back into prehistory, and it's also grafting in influences from Egypt and from Mesopotamia and from Persia and from Greece and even ultimately from Rome a little bit, and all of those things are kind of coming in, and so those are all inheriting earlier beliefs, practices, traditions, which are all kind of coming together in all times in history. So history is always about continuity and innovation. In the question of corruption, so the idea, there's a general ancient myth of the Golden Age where ancient people largely believed that everything had been more pure in the past, and that over time things were growing more and more and more corrupt. And so the ancient peoples would have thought that that things had been growing more corrupt, and the era that they were living in is more corrupt. It's only been in the modern era that people flipped that around and thought things were getting better and we were always progressing. And that was pretty much true, let's say, all the way up through the 60s and 70s, 1960s and 1970s. And then we got into the postmodern era, and you can kind of see the difference between utopian science fiction, where everything was always getting more and more modern and gleaming, and then you suddenly have futures like Blade Runner, where there's dystopian futures, aliens and all that kind of thing, when people are no longer as optimistic as they had been about progress. But yeah, generally speaking, the idea that there was a golden age and things have been corrupted is a past way of viewing things that I don't think is particularly helpful, but it was very widespread in antiquity. Unrecognized Talent asks, could it be possible that the smashing of the first tablet story is representing 10 replacement commandments that the redactor later put in? So I would say that probably what we're dealing with is just two different sources that have two different stories. The reason why the second one where I was saying is the redactor may have had a hand in it is because there's the little lines that actually reference the previous ones which you destroyed. And so the implication is if those were two separate sources, which they aren't necessarily, there also could have been an original source and one that layered on top of it. But in the documentary hypothesis, the idea is that there would be two different sources, and then the redactor editor put the one first, and then the second one added those little bits of phrases in order to have a duplicate story, but have it be essentially taking place a second time. And that same thing happens more than once in the Torah. So they go to, at the beginning of the Exodus, they go to a place and Moses hits a rock and water pours out at a particular spot. And then the end of the story, there's a duplicate of that story, and it's just the same story again, and it just happens again. And so it's probably just a duplicate, but in this case they're not combined together in the same place, and so it seems like they did the same thing twice at the beginning and the end. So Nikolai Ruskinov says, say Ezra compiled the texts of the Pentateuch, why would they keep all the inconsistencies? Whoever was doing the compilation, I imagine, would be quite familiar with the text. So the reason why would be if Ezra and the other scribes already recognized all of these texts as authoritative, then they would be reluctant to change them. So there's like a lot of people, let's use an analogy. There's a lot of, like Christians have, the four Gospels, and they're different. They contradict each other, And so one of the things that some people have done is they take all of the Gospels, they chop them up into little pieces, and they put them together into one Gospel, trying to put it into order. And the problem with it is it gets quite repetitive because everything that's in Mark is repeated in Matthew and so on. So it doesn't really make for a very good story when you do it that way. But the reason why they include everything is because Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John are all authoritative for Christians, and so they don't want to change it. They just want to take these authoritative texts and put them all together. And so the idea of a documentary hypothesis is you take texts which are authoritative and contradictory, and you read one after the other, and now you chop them up into pieces and you put them into an order so that they can be read together. And in some cases that glosses over some of the inconsistencies, like with the two Noah stories that are interspersed with each other. And so that would be why maybe it would happen. It's a theory of why it would happen. Michelangelo, thank you for your support. Appreciate that. Jay asks, current belief is there was never a united monarchy under David and Solomon, so beforehand. Correct? Yes, that is correct. So that archaeology doesn't.
There's a related question right after that.
Oh, there's a.
Address both.
Okay, so Ron Wagner asks right after that, why were there two kingdoms, Israel and Judah? So there's more than two kingdoms. So there's a bunch of little tribes and hill towns. And so what happens is that a northern kingdom, Israel, emerges under the Omrid dynasty. And that is the origin of probably Yahwism and the centralization and the pre-biblical ideas. There are other kingdoms. There are little tribes that aren't important, like Judah and Ammon and Moab and Edom and maybe Gilead and other places that might have counted as that. But then, after the Assyrians destroy the kingdom of Israel and had make a little bit of an alliance with and create a client state out of the hill tribes of Judah, then suddenly the kings of Judah are able to, even though they're not fully independent, they're able to hold a kind of an autonomy against the Assyrians, and they're able to participate in the Assyrian economic boom, and so they become a lot more rich, and this becomes the flowering of the kingdom of Judah. And so, kind of anachronistically, the Judahites, whose height happens after Israel's gone, in retrospect, they put themselves on par with Israel, which they never were. They would have just been one little podunk, poor neighbors of Israel, which would have been the real kingdom. And so in the retrospect, from Judah's perspective, there were two kingdoms. That's why there's two kingdoms. And then also, they also created the myth that the Judahites were actually, and David and their ancestor and Jerusalem was actually the whole origin of this thing, the myth of the united monarchy, like Jay is asking about. But Jerusalem was never of the size, it was never the heart of a large Iron Age kingdom until after the destruction of the northern kingdom. That's when its height happens. And so that's why, yes, it's not the current, I think there's the problem with this thing is that there's there are partisans, right? So there are apologists who want to make more of the Bible more historical and more literal, but it's and so some people, I can't say that everybody agrees, but I would say I don't agree with the scholars who don't agree, because I think that they have a partisan position. So Scott Soykin says, did El become Yahweh, or was Yahweh a replacement? So so we did a whole lecture on Baal, and we talked a little bit about, and we did one on Asherah, and so we talked a little bit about kind of the development of Yahwism. And so El is the older, more distant cosmic, heavenly god of the Canaanite pantheon. Yahweh is a newer god whose exact origins are you have to speculate about. Yahweh absorbs qualities of El. And so, in fact, El, did El become Yahweh? So it's yes, El became Yahweh as opposed to Yahweh just being a replacement. Donnie Lee Gringo in Brazil asks, why do we think some modern Christians in the United States cling on to the Ten Commandments so much, insisting that they be posted in U.S. courthouses and that kind of thing? There's just a lot of fundamentalist Christians in the United States do not understand that the U.S. Constitution and the separation of church and state is the freedom of religion. Freedom of religion is the separation of church and state. They instead don't want freedom of religion. What they want is to impose their religion on everybody else. And so the monuments about the Ten Commandments are a symbol of that to them. And I think it's also the idea of it is that this is based on a particularly uninformed type of Christianity. So as we've read, in reading about Paul, Christians aren't supposed to focus on Old Testament law, but once you no longer have sophisticated scholars, and you're instead just everybody's reading the Bible for themselves in Bible studies, and they're reading a lot of Old Testament, they lose track of that, and so they like the Ten Commandments, and so it becomes a symbol for, I think, a kind of a children's Sunday school kind of church that then becomes the leaders of a church when they're pulled away from actual academically informed theology. Unrecognized talent. Wait, no, there's another query from Donnie Lee. Yeah, sorry, Donnie Lee has the second question. Was Paul's strong condemnation of the law, with Paul's strong condemnation of the law, how did Christianity end up with such a strong connection to the Ten Commandments? Did that develop over the centuries? So yes, so one of the things is, like I say, I read that in the Gospel of Matthew. There's a counter argument in the New Testament. So we have lots of strong condemnation of law, and yet there's a lot of New Testament that is giving an alternate perspective, including Paul even quotes some of the Ten Commandments, for example, when he's talking about commandments being important or living a good life and that kind of a thing. So there are competing perspectives within the New Testament, and yeah, it develops over the centuries. Augustine spends a lot of time talking about the Ten Commandments. He says that, again, he's arguing for a spiritualized understanding of these, but that these are precepts that are prefiguring Christ. And he says specifically things like, Christians aren't supposed to obey them because Christians are not supposed to keep the Sabbath day holy. They worship on Sundays. And so it's understood, but then I think especially, like I was suggesting, this trend especially happens in the modern era with the rise of unfiltered just reading of the Bible. And so once the printing press exists, once there's a lot of literacy, once people are just reading the Bible all the time, then they start to focus on it. It becomes kind of a children's Sunday school lesson. And so then So then it becomes, then people take it, I think they latch onto it, and then it becomes so serious that your whole denomination decides, well, we better start worshiping on Saturday. And so I think it's the confusion really sets in at that point. Unrecognized talent. Is it possible that Moses was originally considered a Messiah due to how many great deeds are ascribed to him? So a Messiah when the Moses stories are being written, a Messiah means anointed, and the people who are anointed are, on the one hand, the king. So that's who we often think of as a Messiah. So the local king of Jerusalem, the king of Judah, is a Messiah. And also the priests are also ordained, and so they also are messiahs. And so, for example, in the Second Temple period, the Qumran community, the Dead Sea Scrolls community, are looking forward to having both a priestly Messiah and a kingly Messiah, I think. So there's more than one Messiah that they are thinking about. And so in the broader definition of Messiah, Moses would be, under that rubric. He's certainly the most important, in the Torah figure. He's the most important founder figure. He's the lawgiver. He's the person to which the 5 books are attributed. And so there are plenty of origin story leaders. So there's Abraham. There is Jacob, who is Israel, the leader, essentially the patriarch of the northern kingdom. There's Judah, the patriarch of the southern kingdom. There's Joseph, who is this important hero. But clearly Moses is the top of that pyramid of these early founder heroes. Jeffroli Evertinitz asks, what are the punishments, and do the 7 sins correlate? I guess I don't know which punishments you're referencing. The punishments for the 10 Commandments?
I think so.
We read the whole thing, and it's not listed. So these are commandments that you're supposed to keep. I'm not thinking that. I mean, the one consequence that was in the list of 10 commandments when it was actually in the preamble or within the commandment structure is if you turn away from God, you're not only going to be cast out, but for 3 and 4 generations, your grandkids and great-grandkids are going to be cast out. And so I think that was a main punishment I saw listed in the 10 Commandments list. Donnie Lee Gringo asks, how did Levitical priesthood end up with Aaron's descendants, with Moses being a brother? Wouldn't the priesthood be more aligned to the more important Moses character? So it's all anachronism. So Aaronid priesthood is, so Donnie Lee Gringo is from this Restoration tradition that we share here, Community of Christ and the Latter-day Saint movement. The Latter-day Saint movement has misconnected Aaronid priesthood with Levitical priesthood. And so the Aaronid priesthood is the high priesthood in ancient Judah. So the Jerusalem kingdom, the southern kingdom. These are the high priests of Jerusalem. So the Levites are just the regular priestly caste from the countryside. And so when the Hezekiah reforms happen, when the Josiah reforms happen, all the Levites are put out of a job, and the Levites have to, the only job they get is that they get to assist the Aaronid priests with the sacrifices, so they get a kind of a secondary job because they're put out of business. All the high places, they're not allowed to do sacrifices anywhere. It's only in the centralized location in Jerusalem. And so that distinction continues, and it's not clear to the people of the Restoration. Joseph Smith doesn't understand that distinction, but it's clear also in the Good Samaritan story where the priest comes and then a Levite comes. The priest is the person who is part of the Aaronid, the Sadducee family, as opposed to somebody who's a Levite. In terms of Moses being a brother, wouldn't the priesthood be more aligned with the more important Moses character? So again, the reality exists first, and then come the stories. So the reality is that the Aaronid priests are important because they are the officials of the king of Judah who understand that their ancestor is called Aaron. Other priests like Jeremiah and the priests of Shiloh, they might consider their ancestor to be Moses, but they're not in charge of Jerusalem, so they've been expelled from Shiloh, and Shiloh doesn't have the Ark of the Covenant anymore. Jerusalem has it, and that kind of thing. And so when Jeremiah and all his people write stories and make Moses be the big hero because they write the most successful stories, that makes Moses the most incredible hero, but that doesn't make them the most powerful. The Jerusalem priests are still the most powerful. And when they try to write their stories, the priestly stories, they're so boring, and they're so caring about their own rituals and all their vessels and how long the ephod has to be and all of this boring stuff, the things that make the Torah boring to read. They are unsuccessful at making Aaron a better hero because they're not as good at writing these stories. So it's backwards. So the importance comes first, then the stories. Rain Weber. The smashing of the tablets always seemed to me a bit childish. Was Moses threatening the Israelites with not having a covenant at all if they didn't fall in line? Maybe it's childish. I mean, I think he's got a pretty good reason to be mad. In the course of the literary story here, if you can imagine all of the things that Moses has gone through, and if you imagine all of the amazing miracles that the Israelites have seen, and they immediately fall into this iniquity with the golden calf, you can see why the level of the frustration, maybe it's childish, but maybe it's not threatening to not have a covenant at all. Maybe it's saying you don't deserve this covenant. So I did all this stuff for you, and we have this special, you're going to be the first community that has this divine law to live with, and you couldn't wait 40 days. Michelangelo says, how are the Ten Commandments influenced by other written laws from before, like Hammurabi's? Sorry if that was already asked by someone else. It hasn't actually already been asked, but yes, I think, so in contrast to the Simpsons episode, which implied that this was the first time anyone's heard these laws before, in 1220 BC, which is actually anachronistic. They're not that old. But yes, all of these other law codes, like Hammurabi's law code, Egyptian law codes, those are earlier, and the first law codes are the one that also influence all the later ones. And so in the same way we were talking about how later spirituality is heirs to what went before, same thing. This law code inherits previous law code ideas from surrounding peoples who we've often make the point that Canaanites, the people in the Levant, they do have a lot of innovations that they're doing, like the Abjad, the writing system that they're creating, has got a lot of originality to it, although they picked up some of the symbols and the idea of it from the fact that Egyptians are right there with their much older, less useful writing system. In the same way that they then adapt that and create a new thing, now there's these law codes and they adapt and create their own law code. Daryl Scott asks, how do evangelicals justify idolizing the first set of the Ten Commandments while ignoring the second set? By not spending a lot of time doing a lot of scholarship, actually reading the whole Bible. It's like, why do they only want to read the Levitical commandment that they use to attack gay people because that's the one that they want to read? So it's not based on it's based on not looking at the whole text, studying it with the last 2 centuries of the academic discipline of literary criticism, where they're thinking of the different sources, where they're aware of maybe a priority of the other set. They just ignore the other set. It's just not something that's read. Frankly, they don't, so it's the Commandments themselves are taken out of the text and just exist on their own in a little pamphlet or something like that. And some of these evangelicals, there was a funny Daily Show story where they took one of these evangelical congressmen that was trying to pass a law to put the Ten Commandments in every public school, a monument to it or whatever in every public school in the U.S. or something. And Stephen Colbert asks him, okay, well, name the Ten Commandments. And he was able to name, like, don't kill, don't steal. I think he got maybe 3 of the 10 Commandments, and this is a guy who wants to put them in all the schools. He doesn't even know them, which is, I don't know that it's more a symbol than anything else, I'd say, as opposed to something that is pretty taken seriously. Tommy Guy is here. How do we know the true sayings of the commandments due to language translation? Like I heard, thou shalt not steal really meant thou shalt not kidnap. Well, so the way you know that is by just doing a deep dive into into the actual language study. So fortunately, we have this is very well studied stuff. So even if you don't know Paleo-Hebrew, which all of us mostly don't know that, you would be able to read very extensive commentaries on every word of the Ten Commandments especially. And so what they would have had is whatever the underlying Hebrew word there for steal, you would have to see where does that exist, that same word, that verb, exist in any other writings, in Paleo-Hebrew, which is to say contemporary biblical writings, because I don't think there is any other texts that are that old. And then you'll see, well, how is it being used in every other instance where that word exists in that? And so we would have then, you would get a lexicon of that word and all of its different uses, and that would allow us to know how that word was being used at the time. And then you'd know the first version of it. And then the next would be how it was translated into the Septuagint in Greek, what word was used in the Greek. In other words, how it was understood in the Second Temple period based on the word, how that same word is being used both in Hebrew and also the Greek translation that's being used for it, so that we can see how it's understood then in the next few hundred years. And we would have all kinds of commentary like that. There's so much the reason why I'm able to do, the kind of commentary that I do on words like the name Moses, like we did. I was able to look at, both the folk Hebrew, Paleo-Hebrew etymology that is existing in the Exodus text. But then I was also able to talk to you about the suffix in ancient Egyptian theophoric names, Mosa, and so that we were able to do that because this has been studied so extensively. Rain Weber asks, is there any indication that the tablets destroyed had different laws than those that were written in the second set? Were they perhaps easier laws without the jealousy of Yahweh? So, Rain, no, I don't think so, because again, I don't necessarily, so the indication in the book of Exodus is that the second tablets had that entirely different set of laws. And so you're saying that the different laws were because they're easier, maybe? So no, so the second set are all those different laws that were like, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. Keep the Passover, celebrate the festival of booths. So all of those other laws. I don't know that those are easier. So in some of those cases, you have a lot more duties that you have to perform. All of the men of Israel have to come 3 times a year and present themselves before the Lord. That may be, I guess you have to say whether it's harder or easier than don't lie. It's something that you have to, it's certainly an obligation that costs money as you have to travel and you have time away from work in order to do that kind of thing. It's a different kind of law rather than easier or not. So no, I don't think it's about whether it's easier or not. Rather, it's a different tradition, the second set of which may be an older tradition. Kelly Higgins, thank you for your support. James McFarland, since Moses educated in Egypt, is it possible the Ten Commandments had an Egyptian origin or source? So in other words, so the law code in Canaan is going to have had, there's cultural influences that are coming from Egypt, and there's cultural influences that are coming from Mesopotamia. But I don't think there's anything in the Ten Commandments where we can say that that this list is drawn very directly from anything out of the Egyptian, and that's not, generally speaking, used as an argument to connect the commandment lists that we have to Moses as a historical figure and to Moses as having an Egyptian connection. There's too many layers of hypothesis, because generally speaking, just even saying that that Moses is a historical figure is already beyond our evidence. So but you would have to just look at the commandments themselves to see if anything is very obviously Egyptian, and I don't think that that's the direction. I mean, I think that there is maybe Egyptian influences, but nobody's able to say, oh, this is really some Egyptian stuff, the way that a collection of some of the sayings in Proverbs, in the book of Proverbs, are just pulled directly from an Egyptian wisdom book, for example. Not all of Proverbs, just a little section of it. Donnie Lee Gringo asks, the LDS Mormon view that the higher law is that the higher law of Melchizedek was on the smashed plates, so the Israelites ended up with the lesser law and Aaronic priesthood. Is that a purely LDS concept? I think so. That's, again, just I would say that that's simply just a speculative idea, and I don't even know that that's Mormon doctrine. That might just be some Mormon speculation. Certainly not what the Strangites Mormons say, but maybe LDS Utah Mormons say that. I've never heard that. Nicola, Donnie mentioned translated of the sealed part of the Book of Mormon, and I was idly wondering how many restoration branches have sealed parts of the Book of Mormon. Definitely off topic. So that's off topic, yes. So part of the idea when Joseph Smith composed the Book of Mormon, he said that the whole sections of it were sealed and were going to be translated later. And so then different would-be successors of Joseph Smith have translated the sealed portions, and there's at least 3 sealed portions that I know of. One in Brazil, one of the most recent ones, but there's another sealed portion as a kind of a prophet in Iowa, and another sealed portion, there's a prophet in Utah that did that. So one in Brazil that I know of for sure, one in Iowa that I know of, and one in Utah that I know, and I think there's more as well. So at least 3 that I've had access to. Michelangelo says, Center Place, why were there 10 commandments instead of 7 or 12? Does 10 have a religious meaning? Does it reflect a transition from a 12-based numbering system to decimal, for example? That's a great question. So yeah, 10 is also a magic number, but as you point out, it's kind of a later magic number than 12 especially, or 7 to some extent. And so it had been much more common and earlier in the biblical text to especially use the number 12. And so now that's an interesting point that I've never really thought of. But yeah, it's a very early move to having 10 as a special number, like you say, a decimal numbering that's emerging. Eric Taylor, how did early Christians prevent new divine revelations? That is to say, new Pauls. So we had a lecture on the Didache, which is written in the 1st century, probably in a time period when there's still a major tradition that's like Paul among Christians of apostles and prophets who are going around, mendicant guys who are going around without any property, who are coming to your community, preaching by the Spirit. In other words, offering new revelations, and living just by charity, and then having to move on to another community and preaching the gospel and preaching by the Spirit with new revelations again. But there's already in the Didache all kinds of warnings about false apostles and false prophets who are trying to scam you out of your money or that kind of a thing, or who are giving bad revelation that say they're self-serving or that contradicts the rest of the gospel as early Christians understood it. And so that was more and more of a problem. And so over time, the communities reacted against that tradition, and instead the power in those communities went to the local community leader, the overseer of that community, the bishop, and then the bishops ended up having the authority, and they refused to admit these wandering apostles. So then that impulse for mysticism in early Christianity was then channeled into first Hermetic monks living off in the desert, and then Cenobitic monks living in, and nuns living in communities where they take vows of poverty and live together in monasteries, and they're having a spiritual life that way, as opposed to creating all this new divine revelation. They still do. So there's all kinds of visionaries that occur all through the Middle Ages and into the present day in Christianity, and even in the Catholic Church. So the Catholics have to deal with visionaries today. Dave Anderson, thanks for your support. Electronics Workshop, thanks for your support. Hey, we are at 180 likes. If you guys just all press like right now, we'll get to 200, and that'll give us a little burst, and then maybe a bunch more people will be here, and the questions will just keep going on and on and on, because Skeptic asks, did Judaism as we know it now begin with the Ten Commandments? If so, how do we describe the religion before this covenant? So no, Judaism as we know it now begins with the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in year 70 or so, 73. And so then when the commandment-based religion surrounded by the temple, priesthood, the Aaronid priests, the Sadducees, was eliminated, and it could no longer exist, then suddenly they had to rethink, the focus of the religion, or not suddenly, they'd been rethinking it for a while, and it became focused on prayer, on scripture study, and on the teachers, the rabbis who were teaching the scriptures. And so Judaism as we know it now begins with the destruction of the Second Temple. In terms of the Ten Commandments, the Ten Commandments are part of an earlier version of Judaism, the Second Temple Judaism, which is born out of the compilation of the Torah, of which the Ten Commandments are a central part of the Torah. And so I would say that Second Temple Judaism is kind of based on the recovery of the temple, building a second temple, but also the compiling of the Torah into its present component by Ezra or somebody around the time of Ezra. And what was it like before that time period? It was like paganism. It was like the rest of Canaanite religion, polytheistic religions. So very similar to anything like that. Michelangelo asks, what source wrote about Moses not reaching the promised land, and what was the intention or the meaning? So yeah, I would have to look at the end of each of the sources. Maybe we'll probably do eventually. We've done this kind of who was Paul, who was John, the beloved apostle, or something like that. And we might do what we've done. Who was John the Baptist and things, and we've done some Old Testament characters. Who was David? So we should probably do a who was Moses. But I would have to look at ends of numbers and see which source is actually doing the writing. So we can see kind of what the end of how the Moses story ends for the Yahwist and the Elohist and the priestly source, and then how it ends at Deuteronomy. And I don't remember what it is. So there's ambiguous endings for Moses because there's, like you say, there's duplicates for the end of Moses' story, and so I just would have to look at which source wrote which one. Empress Goddess Spiritual says, do you think the Moses and Jesus stories are similar? Early Christians did. So early Christians see Moses as, so they saw the Old Testament and the New Testament typologically, which is like a type and antitype. It's like when you have you're a mint and you're creating coins, and there's a press that you use, and you go kunk, and when you're done with it, then there's a coin that has an image on it. And so the coin making thing is the antitype, and then the coin is the type. And so Moses is like this prefiguring thing, and Jesus is the image that appears. So Moses is prefiguring Jesus, according especially to when we read that the text from the Matthean community, the book of Gospel of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount. The author of Matthew is so convinced that that Jesus is another Moses, or that the Moses story prefigures Jesus, that the gospel is written in sort of imitation of the Torah, where Jesus gives 5 great discourses, beginning with the Sermon on the Mount, and those that's not accidental. It's because there's 5 books of Moses. And so definitely that connection has definitely been made. Rain Weber asked, have I heard of Dan McClellan, an up-and-coming young Mormon Bible scholar? I don't know if I know Dan McClellan. I'm just going to be sorry. I'm always terrible about names. I don't think I do, but hopefully maybe I'm going to be at a conference out in Utah this summer, and so maybe he'll be there and I'll get to hear a presentation. Captain Hardluck says, I feel that we are living in an age of constant law smashing, an endless cycle of postmodern infinite interpretation. This story seems to urge society to cast something in stone. What are your thoughts? Yeah, so I agree with you that there's a problem with postmodern deconstruction, where we are just constantly deconstructing everything and smashing everything. So even though this, I'm the one that got named this lecture Smashing the 10 Commandments, and I did a bunch of deconstruction of it. Part of the reason for it is that I guess I'm trying to, especially as a Christian and as a pastor, I'm trying to call into question this sort of kind of weird modern Christian focus on the 10 Commandments and wanting to put plaques of the 10 Commandments as monuments in places without having really read it or thinking of the implications, or even understanding that Christianity at its foundation, at least the second foundation with Paul, but I think also with Jesus, is not about literally focusing on living out 2,600-year-old anachronistic laws as literalistically as possible. That's not, I don't think, what we should be doing at all, but that doesn't mean that I believe that we should constantly be deconstructing. I actually devote most of my time to positive construction, where I want to craft new narratives, new ideas, so that we are actually operating in a positive vision of moving forward. So I agree with you that you can get into a deconstruction loop that it seems like it's never going to go anywhere, and I reject that kind of postmodern impulse. Actually, I'm more of a utopian idealist who wants to believe in good and to focus on good, as opposed to simply suggesting that there can't ever be any such thing, because we have to deconstruct it always. James McFarland says, does the Quran allude to any of the Ten Commandments? Yes, and there is actually a big, long Muslim tradition of the commandments. I don't know that they're all in the Quran. I think that they're in other writings, and it's an interesting tradition. And I'm not overly familiar with it, and I ran out of time to include that. If I could have included it as easily as I did the Samaritans and the Strangite Mormons, with just a little details, but actually it's a long and interesting and complicated tradition that is worth looking into. Electronics Workshop says, do you believe in creation myths, or do you just know the stories and related history? So the creation myths are not historic. I don't believe they're historic. I believe that they are religious ideas where ancient people were trying to express theological ideas about the purpose and meaning of the world. And in that sense, I believe in the creation stories as containing meaning. They did not occur literally in any of that sense. Those guys had way less insight into the actual formation of the universe than we have now. Actually, modern cosmology has been just rapidly advancing just in my lifetime, and what people know now, in the current scientific understanding, in very robust cosmological theories about the origin of the universe, is way more than they knew when I was born 50 some years ago. So if we want to have insights into the physical origins of the cosmos, there's all kinds of insights that we can have as we study it. That doesn't tell us anything about meaning, because there's no we're just doing physical science that is just telling us how something is and how it exists and what happened, not about meaning. And so what you look to in myths, in identity stories, you look to those for meaning, and we can understand what ancient peoples were trying to convey as a meaning within their limitations of their time period. Michael Lewis says, if the Israelites are autochthonous, what would Moses' role be necessary? Would Moses' role be necessary? So no, not necessarily. So since they are autochthonous, so the two things, if you're going to have an identity story, a creation story, a personal national creation myth, not the creation of the world cosmology myth, a national identity story, you either are autochthonous, in other words, you came from there, you guys were always there, you're there as old as the hills, or you came from somewhere else. And people don't always know that. In fact, they usually don't, because usually actual history of a people, going back even into the oral tradition, is many hundreds of years older than anybody can actually remember. And once you introduce an idea into an oral tradition, it becomes just as real as anything that went back older than that. And so Israelites have multiple identity stories about them coming from other places. So Abraham comes from the land of the Chaldees and comes to Canaan. Moses comes from Egypt and comes to Canaan. And so those are identity stories that understand how the people in their place in the land, but they don't refer to the actual history, because, as you say, it turns out that they really simply emerged out of the surrounding Canaanite neighbors, or not aliens who came in. So the nice part about it is that the Judges, the Joshua story, the genocide of the Canaanites as described in the Bible is really pretty awful, and God commands it. But the nice part about it is that that's not historical. It didn't really happen. So no Canaanites were killed, because they just emerged out of the Canaanites. The archaeology doesn't support a general destruction layer the way the Bible narrative describes. Julie Bazuski says, I think Christians often stereotype Judaism as unthinking law followers, but as a Catholic, I had to learn the precepts of the church as well as the Ten Commandments. Can you comment? So yeah, this is, yes, Christians do stereotype Judaism as unthinking law followers. And then Christians also immediately fall into being unthinking law followers. So in the first place, Judaism is not about unthinking law following. There's a lot of components of Judaism that is about very seriously thinking law following. And then there is a lot of Judaism, like Reformed Judaism, that is very much thinking about how can we adapt principles of tradition and law to the present day without being legalistically bound by any of the traditions. And so then that's hardly any different from what we do here at Center Place. And so, yeah, so it is a stereotype and a shorthand that Christians ascribe to Judaism, and it is often very hypocritical because Christians often fall into kind of mindless legalism themselves without realizing it. And so Jesus has a saying on this, which is, why do you spend so much time looking at the mote that is in your brother's eye when you can't even see the beam that is in your own eye? So we are blinded by our own failings, and we're very quick to point out a perceived error in others, and that is often hypocritical, as Jesus points out. Videos for Stuff says, do you think the movie The Ten Commandments led to a lot of people in that generation who saw it in theaters and on TV all the time an undue respect for the Ten Commandments? Oh. I don't know. Maybe it did. Maybe it does. I feel like it was already a pretty big deal. I feel like the people have spent a long time. The Ten Commandments are an easy thing that you can put on a little card. I mean, I think it's a thing that you can hang up on a picture on your wall. When you have a list like that, it's very easy. I mean, an undue respect. I mean, I think that, as you're calling it, I think that, for example, at a certain point in the Middle Ages, there was just an amazing, people like lists, and so there was just an amazing idea of the 7 deadly sins, and people had, they focused on all the 7 deadly sins, even though the 7 deadly sins is not even scriptural. It's just a list that somebody made, right? And so once you have a list, people like lists, and I think that that's true. One of the selling points of the Ten Commandments. I think the movie, it's just such a good movie. I've seen that movie, dozens and dozens of times, even though it's super long. And so I think it just, I think it maybe gives people an undue sense that in the story's historicity, because they made it very realistic seeming for the time. It's an amazing movie, but it's a good movie because it's based well on the actual biblical text, and then it's further informed by early Jewish tradition and other traditions. So it's they didn't take a lot of crazy license with it. So several participants asked, can you make an ebook version of Scattering of the Saints? So a book that I edited many, many years ago is called Scattering of the Saints. And the publisher is John Whitmer Books. So I would have to talk to the publisher about it. And so I think they would like to. And the question is how hard it would be. The problem with a lot of ebook formats is, so Scattering of the Saints is heavily illustrated, and so it is it's easy to produce a PDF of it, but is it easy to make a ebook reader? I'm not really sure. So we'd have to look into it. I'll ask the publisher. K. Tempest Bradford, who is your favorite character in Charlton Heston's The Ten Commandments movie? Oh man. So my favorite character, I guess, is Seti. I just love the Pharaoh Seti. I love all the characters. So, I mean, Ramses is amazing. That guy is just, he's the best. Nefertiti is so evil. She's so wonderful, what's her name? Memnet, the slave, the proud slave woman. She's amazing. The master builder, Vincent Price, is amazing. Dathan, the rebel, Joshua, the hero. It just goes on and on and on. I even like Charlton Heston is great too. So anyway, it's just a fantastic movie. I'm going to watch it again. So I said my favorite though is SETI. I love SETI. So Kelly Higgins, lecture idea: review several sword and sandal epics, including the Ten Commandments. Announce the titles ahead of time so we can all watch before the lecture. I think that's a great idea. That'd be fun. How would we do that? I guess, okay, so I've done it before. So I did the lecture on Life of Brian, right? And so we could do same kind of thing, maybe for 10 Commandments, and that'd be fun. Maybe we'll do it for a holiday. Mike Carperwith says, there's a bunch of people in the live chat who have literally been expecting you to smash something, and they are very disappointed that I failed to smash anything. So Leandro has actually made a prop for me. So I have my tablet here. So I gotta smash. Oh, I wasn't supposed to. Anyway, I smashed it. There you are. So don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to our channel. If you're able, please consider a donation. So you can do that at our website, centerplace.ca/donate. And we just remind you, we're off next week, but on March 5th, we're back with how do we know which of the sayings of Jesus are authentic and what are some of those that might be.